Thank you, Rachel. And to my Eagles fans out there, I comfort you guys. We can't be in the Super Bowl every year. Like I tell my Dallas Cowboy fan friends, you can't make it to the NFC Championship game every 30 years either. So if we can't celebrate our victories, we can celebrate just being able to kick them around a little bit more. We've been in a series called Rest for the Restless, and we've been talking about the promise and the opportunity to enjoy the grace of God in rest. We've been looking at Psalm 23. We started looking at Psalm 23 last week. We ran out of time, and we're going to finish it up this week. But we're laying out a theology of the Sabbath, that it is a gift, something that can be received, something that can change our lives. In the Old Testament, the Sabbath was something absolutely radical that made the people of God stand out. In an agricultural world, to take a day off from planting seed is just absolute foolishness. But the people of God were different. God was their provider. And they were no longer slaves anymore. They can enjoy the Sabbath. They can enjoy the rest. And I've talked about carving out 24 hours to think differently about your life, to not be producing, to not be consuming, which is what the world wants from us, to think differently about that time. But at the heart of what we're driving for isn't just to get a day to maintain some rules, right? The ancient Jews had a day, and they ruined it with their rules. It points us to something way deeper, an entirely different approach to life rooted in the Sabbath. All right, so we're going to work through Psalm 23 in a few moments, but I'd like to tell my story and a little bit about how God worked in my life to begin thinking about some of these things. And if you're ever around here and you share your story, a couple of things we'll ask you to do is we'll ask you to sit down, because it's not about any one of us. And the other thing we'll ask you to do is we'll ask you to write it down, because the stories always point to something beyond ourselves. And so I hope that's something you hear in my story. So for me, we need to go back about 20 years. My life was really good. Things were solid. God had given me the opportunity to serve in a particularly large church. I was being trusted with more and more responsibility. Our family was growing. We were in the middle of having our third child. And from the outside, life was good because life was good. And then I noticed something strange. It was like I was being followed. I didn't have language for it at the time, but looking back, I can name them as the four horsemen. If you're not familiar with the metaphor, in the book of Revelation, the four horsemen show up, and they don't cause the end of history. They announce that something catastrophic is already unfolding. And I didn't realize it then, but the four horsemen that I was experiencing were announcing the end of my effective ministry as I knew it. The end of my health, and sort of the end of me being the person that I felt like God had called me to be, the end of my freedom. The four horsemen were not the cause of my burnout. Let's be really clear. But they were the warning signs of it. Most burnouts, as I've studied over the years, aren't spectacular. They don't happen on stages. They happen quietly, when too much exposure to vulnerability caused people to retreat into self-protection and survival. Looking back, I named the four horsemen as bitterness, resentment, self-pity, and victim thinking. Here's what was really happening. The ministry was expanding, my family was expanding, my vulnerability was expanding, and I didn't have the wisdom or support to carry it well. I kept thinking that I could get ahead of it with a little bit more efficiency, a little bit more productivity, and a little bit more effort. Things would get easier. Just if I could just squeeze it a little bit harder. And then in the middle of all that, I lost my father relatively suddenly. These things happen in life. but it was like the engine I had taken all the way up so high in its RPMs, it just blew a leak. And it didn't matter how much fluids I poured into that engine, it just kept pouring out, and the four horsemen began running me into the ground. Let me see if I can just define the four horsemen. Bitterness is anger and disappointment that has been nurtured over time. It has a life of its own, and it can hijack us. It can hijack our mood when triggered. Resentment is how we keep bitterness alive. The word says it itself. It's when we resentiment. We choose to feel the disappointment again, over and over again. We reject forgiveness so we can hold on to our contempt. In recovery language, resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And it was a poison to my soul. Self-pity is when disappointment turns inward. It's telling yourself a distorted story about how hard your life is. For me, it was completely self-absorbed. My life was full of good gifts, but my mind only returned to what was difficult. And the most dangerous horseman of all was victim thinking. Victim thinking says that I have no agency. Other people are either my persecutors or maybe my rescuers. I have to do things this way, even if it is self-destructive. Victim thinking is the horseman that makes Sabbath seem impossible. Now, if one or two of these things in your life, it doesn't mean that burnout is inevitable. Mine wasn't spectacular. No one knew. Even I didn't really fully know. I was just slowly ground down, weaker, more passive, increasingly joyless, and anxious in ways that I didn't even have words for. No one grows up to hopefully burn out someday. It wasn't my circumstances. It was me and how I had learned to survive. I had great parents, and they had real strengths, and like every other parent, they had gaps. My father went through a season of instability when I was young, and that produced anger and rage, and the rest of us learned to tiptoe around him. We learned to manage around the monster that might show up. And I learned two things early. First, don't reveal your emotions. It's not safe because my emotions activate his emotions, and who knows what might happen then. Secondly, I learned this: don't depend on others. It will be used against you. When I was vulnerable and I leaned on him, his provision often came with strings that were not worth the cost. So, like my siblings, I went out and got a job early. And early on in that job, I was 15, I was told I might lose my job because I worked too slowly. And I remember exactly what I told myself that day. I said, I will never be accused of not working hard ever again. That sentence became a vow. I don't know if you've ever made a vow before. The scriptures are pretty, they caution you heavily against them because vows like that don't just shape behavior, they shape identity. I became the try-hard. I would bring my best to everything: work, parenting, marriage, ministry. And there's nothing wrong with hard work until you define yourself by it. Later, I came to faith during college, and I understood how the gospel affected my eternity, yet it has taken me so much longer to understand how it was meant to transform my identity. Well, let's jump back forward to when the four horsemen showed up around 20 years ago. I was overseeing 400 volunteers. We were about to have our third child. On the outside, things looked good. Remember, this is because they were good. They were very good. But on the inside, I was collapsing. The four horsemen were trampling my soul, and I could not perform my way out of this. I was looking to God in this, and he began speaking to me in many ways. And one phrase I heard from a sermon changed everything. It wasn't the work, it was the work beneath the work. It wasn't the circumstances, it was what I was trying to get the work to do for me. I'd built my identity on being successful or competent, admired, liked, being pleasing to people. But what ended up happening is I needed outcomes to feel okay. I needed approval to feel secure. I needed results to justify my life. And in all my striving for independence, ironically, I had become needy. When I didn't get those needs met, my vow committed me. When I did not get the needs that my vow had committed me to, the four horsemen showed up. Bitterness, resentment, self-pity, and victim thinking. I didn't just say a prayer and things changed, but I did start studying and start reading, and I came across the Sabbath, and studying the Sabbath began my journey out. I learned this promise from 1 Peter. His divine power has given us everything for life and godliness. Everything I needed. And this one, which we reflected on a little bit last week. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. All four horsemen continue to preach the same sermon. You deserve a better deal. Psalm 23 answers them with a single sentence. You lack nothing. I'd ask myself, is it my circumstances or is it me? As I started reading and reflecting on the meaning of the Sabbath taught me that rest is something I receive, not something I earn. My striving was all about me. God never asked me to exhaust myself for him. Quite the opposite. He gave me rest. Also, God never promised me that things would always be easy. Rather, he promised peace, rest, and joy, even in the most challenging of circumstances. In these early days of ministry and family life, Kathleen would often remind me of what the gospel makes normal for believers. It was Paul's testimony in 2 Corinthians. He said, we are hard-pressed but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. Kathleen would often quote that to me and add this one. Not so much from the Bible, but it worked. We may be squished, but we're not squashed. Something started happening in my life that gave me a vision of who I could be regardless of results. It gave me a perspective and a grounding that would give me the grace to persevere and endure difficult seasons and challenges. I could see clearly that regardless of outside circumstances, there would always be peace available for me on this inside. And I learned to chase away the four horsemen. But the four horsemen don't disappear forever. They linger. They hope will invite them back in. So I had to rebuild my life, not on an oath of performance, but on the gospel and on the lifestyle of Sabbath. Not just a day, but the truth beneath it. The work is complete. God has given us everything I need. I'm not a victim. But if the horsemen go unchallenged, they will eat my soul from the inside. They will poison me, and I will become a simple series of anxious reactions. All righty. At the heart of the Sabbath is the gospel. If anyone is in Christ, new creation. I don't have to anxiously react to circumstances, but actively choose to enjoy the gifts and live into the calling I have been given. He has done the work I could never do. Jesus is in control of outcomes. I live from a calling, not just to ministry, but a calling to life. And I'm not driven by circumstances. I'm not driven, I'm called to the life that is truly life, and central to that calling is resting in the truth that God has done all of the work. As Jesus said, the work of God is this, to believe in the one. he has sent. Appreciate you listening to me. Let me transition this, though. We have an opportunity just to kind of listen to the end of the teaching from Psalm 23. And if something kind of triggered you there, kind of hold on to that and see if God has something to say through the psalm. All right? So I'll be real quick, but let's read and let's see if we can hear what God has to say to us through Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We're not going to be able to teach all of this, and Psalm 23 doesn't specifically teach the Sabbath, but it points to the God, the shepherd, behind the Sabbath. And what I'm hoping that we can get to is a vision of life that's rooted in Sabbath rest. All right, and so we'll have four things. Well, the heart of it is living called, not driven, all right? Last week we talked about it's about ceasing, not switching. I don't know if you're anything like me. An opening in the calendar opens up, right? And maybe I set aside a day, right, to rest. And what happens when I see that openness? The ambitiousness in me, the restlessness in me says, let me fill that with another ambition. I'm going to become a parent hero in this moment. I'm going to become a household hero in this moment. I'm going to become an Instagram hero in this moment where I'm going to do something and I'm going to produce. Why? Because we've been taught that production is at the heart of our identity, right? I'm going to make some different kinds of bricks. I might not work for the man. I'm going to work for this thing here. But deeply, it continues to be driven by ambition. And when God gives you an opportunity to cease, he invites you to rest. The sheep matter to the shepherd regardless. Every sheep gets to lie down regardless. A lot of times anxious sheep won't lie down. They'll just stand and they'll never rest. The shepherd has to come and make them lie down. On another occasion, I can tell you the different stories God has used to make me lie down, right? For a lot of us, though, we have a hard time ceasing. To stop our doing, all of a sudden, it doesn't necessarily stop what's going on in our minds, right? And some of us don't want to stop doing, because if we stop doing, what might happen in our minds? We might have to be alone with our thoughts. We might have to be alone with our fears. We might have to be alone with our sadness, our grievances, our bitterness, our resentment, our self-pity. And because we're afraid of what that quiet might reveal, we just find a new ambition to keep us moving. A simple application is next time you see an opening, don't just fill it with the next ambition. Ask yourself, what would be restorative, right? Like a lot of people want to put a whole bunch of rules on what a Sabbath day looks like. I'm the first one to say, I love cutting the grass on the Sabbath. It grieved my heart once I had to start paying my son to start cutting the grass. He needed to learn to cut the grass, right? But I'm I wanted to be doing it, right? I just love it, right? And it's restorative for me most of the time, right? So but ask the question, what is restorative to your soul? What helps you to live into your identity as to who you are? Don't just slap a bunch of rules on a period of time. Live into the truth that who you are matters to God. What would it look like for you to experience restoration? What would quiet waters look like for you if God would lead you by them? We talked about that, so I'm going to jump to the next one. Sabbath is about accepting and not attempting. For most of my story, it was like, okay, I will rest when I get there. Once I get this done, once I arrive, then it'll be okay, right? Once I get to the next stage of life, once I get the promotion, once I get enough saved, once rest is always something that's out there. And we stay on the hamster wheel. And what God and why the Sabbath means the Christian life is absolutely different than everything else in the world, is everything else in the world always says, once you lose the weight, once you're in the relationship, once X, Y, or Z happens, then. And the Sabbath, and God comes and says, you know what? Every 7 days, you get to relax, you get to enjoy, you get to celebrate. Even if you've had a bad week, even if you ruined everything, you still get a day off. You still get to rest. You still get to enjoy. You still matter. Who you are isn't dependent upon your results. Sometimes we attach our peace to the results of our attempting, but for many of us, we attach our peace to the results of what's going on in someone else's life. Have you ever heard somebody say that I can only be as happy as my least happy kid? And there's something existentially true about that, right? Because we grieve with those we grieve, but that's a lie. And it's not true. And it's a burden that you would put on your children that's just not fair. Our kids need us, need to see in us a way forward of being happy regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what's going on in other people's lives. If they see that our happiness is connected to them, you know what they're going to do? They're going to connect their happiness to somebody else as well. You cannot lay that burden on them. It's a demonstrative slavery. You are enslaved to their well-being. You can't do it. You have to show them something different. Romans 15:7 says, accept one another as Christ has accepted you. Jesus accepted you before you had it all together. He gives you the grace of Sabbath in the worst of all weeks. He doesn't leave you where you are, but as long as you're waiting for you to be different to feel okay, as long as you're waiting for somebody else to be different to feel okay, you become enslaved to those outcomes. And you become enslaved to the attempting. And you become needy for those outcomes. You become needy for this person to change. You become needy for yourself to change. You become needy to the results and enslaved to those results. And exhaustion comes. When you're always trying to be someone you're not, that's exhausting. When you're always depending on somebody else to be somebody they're not, that's exhausting. What I'm not saying is that we settle for life and lay on the couch with Cheetos, right? I'm not saying that. God accepts us where we are. He doesn't leave us where we are, right? But as long as you're trying to live in an unreality, that's exhausting and it creates anxiety. In recovery, we learn the serenity prayer. This is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Sometimes in my anxious moments, I'll sit down and I'll write the very, what I think is a long list of the things I can control, which is like barely my own behavior, right? And the list of the things we cannot control, it's like everything, right? And yet, when we attach our ability to rest to everything that we cannot control, it's a slavery. We become bound to those things. We become needy to those things. That's why the story of slavery is so central to understanding Sabbath. You are not in Egypt anymore. You are not the result of your bricks. You are not the result of your commodities. You're not the result of however Pharaoh's foremen are feeling about you. You matter. You can rest regardless of your brick making, regardless of your bricklaying, regardless of the foreman. You can rest. You can rest and be happy even if your spouse is not. You can rest and be happy even if your child cannot. Your sense of well-being and your ability to rest is not dependent on anything else. You lack nothing. Peace doesn't come from attempting. Peace comes from accepting grace. In a moment of struggle, a question to ask yourself is this: what am I struggling to accept? Third, the Sabbath offers us the opportunity to have clarity and not clutter. Psalm 23 talks about how he leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. I don't know about you, but when I'm on the path and I know where I'm supposed to be going, I'm able to enjoy what's going on around me, right? When I don't know where I'm going, my vigilance rises, my anxiety rises, my adrenaline rises. I actually love being in the woods. I love hiking. I don't do a ton of it, but I love being a camp counselor. I love to lead hikes. And when you're leading the hike, we would even do night hikes, and I thought they were particularly fun, right? But when you're leading the hike, typically speaking, you're on the path, and you can see the path ahead of you. And when you can see the path ahead of you, you can enjoy all the surroundings. You can be in conversation with this person, and it's a very interactive thing. But as soon as, whether the leaves cover the path or when the path becomes unclear, enjoyment stops. Because you're like, where are you? And where are you going? All of a sudden, when there isn't a clear path, your adrenaline starts rising, your vigilance rises. You're not engaging and asking somebody about their whatever, right? You're entirely focused. And when you're like leading a whole bunch of middle schoolers, right? And all of a sudden they realize that you don't know where you're going, it's just a madhouse, right? Kids start making stuff up and it gets weird, right? The Sabbath gives us an opportunity to be clear on what's most important. It gives us a clear path. And when we know what our path is and when we have clarity on what's most important, we can relax. Vigilance, adrenaline goes down, and we can enjoy. But it requires something really, really important. I don't know if you ever took a marketing class. If you take a marketing class and they talk about advertisement, on every single advertisement, there's one essential thing. It's the most important thing in the entire ad, right? And it's not what the ad is saying, it's what the ad is not saying. It's the white space. Without the white space, there's no prominence. You go look at ads or signs or whatever. What you will find is that there's a disproportionate amount of empty space. The empty space enables you to see what's most important. There's a certain size that gets your attention, but if it's a good ad, most of that space is relatively empty, so you can focus on the one thing that needs to be communicated. When we fill every single spot in our lives, we don't actually have any sense of prominence. We don't know what's important. We don't have perspective. And we live our lives reacting our way through. And we have no idea if we're just being enslaved to our circumstances. Why? Because we're simply reacting. Sabbath gives us the opportunity to cease, stop, step back, and know what is most important. Understand what is prominent. In Jesus' day, they did practice the Sabbath, and they were like hardcore about practicing the Sabbath. But they're so hardcore about practicing the Sabbath, they filled it with all these rules. And so everybody was like filled with all sorts of anxiety. Am I going to break a rule and get busted by the cancel culture of their day? There's always going to be culture wars, right? And so everybody was so filled, they didn't understand it. Well, there was a prominent moment that everybody was missing one day when Jesus shows up at the synagogue, and he would go to the synagogue every week. Well, this one day he was at a synagogue, and a man shows up with a shriveled hand, and Jesus starts moving towards him to heal him, and everyone starts freaking out. They're like, he's going to break one of the rules. He's going to work on the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, people, let me ask you guys a very simple question. Should we do good on the Sabbath, or should we not do good on the Sabbath? And they're like, I don't know. Like they didn't get it why their life was so busy. They're so busy reacting to all their little rules that they're enslaved to that they missed the moment right in front of them. And Jesus, like, he heals them and moves on. And they missed him. They did not see God in front of them. Why? Because they were anxiously reacting to their rules and to their very, very busy lives. They missed God in their midst. And it should have broken their hearts. They missed the opportunity to do mercy. Now, the application of this is you don't necessarily need to run around and do a whole bunch of good things on the Sabbath, but maybe you should. How do you know? Jesus did whatever the Father had called him to. There's a moment where he will walk into a pool where a whole bunch of sick people were. And he'll walk by a whole bunch of sick people and heal one specific person, and he will leave. Why? Because he was called. He wasn't driven by the needs, but he was called to express love and mercy, and he was called to do whatever his Father had led him to. And when your life is filled and cluttered with 1,000 ambitions and constant busyness, you'll never have the clarity to know exactly what you're called to. That's why we want to live called and not driven. A little application here. This isn't just, being at church and having a day set aside is really good. But on a daily basis, do you have solitude? Like screenless solitude, where you can simply hear from God and respond to him, where there's silence. Is there white space in every single day? And I'm not saying be mindful just to your body. That's good. It's a really good thing. But be mindful to your Creator, because he may be calling you into something very specific this Tuesday. Will you know it? Will you know it? Or will you be too cluttered to hear it? Sabbath, and a way of being in Sabbath, enables us to rest, enables us to be clear, enables us to enjoy. We talked about this last week, and we'll just be brief about it. The Sabbath is about feasting, not fasting. One of the reasons why nobody does the Sabbath is a bunch of Christians turned it into a whole bunch of rules. They're like, all right, we're going to get everybody to be Christians by using the U.S. government, because that always works. If we can get power in the U.S. government and get everybody to obey our rules, then we'll all have a really good society. Remember how well prohibition worked? Yeah, that was great. The Sabbath laws, everybody was so happy. It never works that way. It never works that way. Fasting is not what the Sabbath is about. There's a time and place for Sabbath or for fasting, but the Sabbath is all about feasting. It's all about celebration. David said, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." In the face of a broken world, I get to enjoy and celebrate. In the face of a broken life, I get to celebrate. And even in the space of a broken heart, there's still rest and feast for me. It's always there, regardless of whether I deserve it, regardless of whether the world deserves it. It's always there by grace. Towards the end of our life, we're never going to remember our fasts and all the rules we kept, but we will remember the feasts and what we learned to enjoy. There's a famous quote by C.S. Lewis who said, "I believe God not because I see him, but by him I see all things." I'd love to tweak that and say, I can enjoy life not because I see God, but by him I can enjoy all things. Let me remind us of the applications. Are you open to ceasing the productivity and the consumption? What could you cease? If you're struggling, is there something that needs to be accepted? What would one screen-free hour do for you? And finally, what could you be celebrating? These are the heart of a Sabbath life. We can keep going, and I can keep going. I could write a book on this. I actually did. And someday it might even get released. In the meantime, we did do a 21-day email campaign for you to try to just reflect on this on a daily basis. For me, this has been a 20-year journey that I still work on. If the 4 horsemen are heavy on you, don't try to fight them alone. Let me pray. Dear God, we're grateful that we live not according to the commodities we produce, but the covenant that you've offered. And we accept the grace that you offer and ask that you teach us to practice it in the way we live. God, we know that there's rest for us, not just for our own selfish pleasure, but God, we know that when we are well rested, we reflect your light well. And God, we ask that that light would reflect brightly into a dark world who needs the hope that you have given us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.